Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to choose a research advisor. Today, we have two of our panelists, Nunez Severino and Paula Martinez-Feduchi. And I'm going to start off with introductions before going into the panel session. At any point, definitely feel free to ask any questions through our Q&A function in the middle of the Zoom. Alrighty, so let's start with intros. So Paula is a second-year PhD student in the Molecular Medicine and Mechanisms of Disease program at the University of Washington. She received a BS in Biology and a BS in Neuroscience from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Soil-transmitted parasitic worms infect over a billion people worldwide and are a major source of disease and economic burden. In Dr. Astra Bryant's lab, Paula's thesis seeks to work to identify the neural mechanisms that underlie temperature-driven host seeking by Strongyloides stercoralis, infective larvae. Outside of the lab, she participates in scientific communication and outreach initiatives to increase interest and retention in STEM. And our second speaker is Lewis. He is a second year PhD student in the Neuroscience graduate program at Brown University, advised by Dr. Carolina Haskoffer in the Clinical Neuroscience Laboratory. He earned his BA in psychology from Hunter College, CUNY, where he completed his undergraduate research training through the NIH-funded BP Endure program in Dr. Nesha Borgard's lab. His doctoral research in the CNL focuses on understanding how central and peripheral neuroimmune pathways can serve as therapeutic targets for substance use disorders and co-occurring psychiatric conditions. By integrating multimodal neuroimaging with biomarker analysis and clinical trials, his work aims to identify biological mechanisms underlying treatment response and recovery. Beyond his research, Lewis is deeply committed to mentorship and building community. Through the Carney Institute for Brain Science, he has served as a graduate group leader, organized weekly workshops, support visiting summer undergrads from the Leadership Alliance. In his free time, he enjoys discovering new music, spending time with friends, and playing Pokemon games. With that, definitely happy to have our two panelists who are also alumni of our GSEC mentorship program, which is now known as our first year graduate student mentor program. So in short, I'm going to start off with each panelist just describing their experience in how they chose their research advisor. Afterwards, with some Q&A from our set panel questions, and then Q&A from the audience. At any point, if you have questions, definitely feel free to use the Q&A function. But to start off, Paula, how did you go about in choosing your research advisor?
Yeah, so as all of you heard, I'm doing parasitic worm research, which is really left, out of field for me. I was doing epigenetics in Alzheimer's disease before graduate school. And so when I first joined, I was looking for neurodegeneration and aging research labs. But I decided to, use a rotation as an opportunity to do something a little bit different. And I mainly chose my third rotation in my current PI because of what I heard from students. So I was looking for a really strong, supportive mentor. And I heard from someone that my PI was, they had nothing but great things to say. And even in the neuroscience program, which is a different PhD program that I'm in than the one I'm in, she was really involved with mentoring students and having an open door policy for people to go to. So I was really interested in speaking with her. And so before I even set up a meeting with her, I set up a coffee like meetings with current lab members to get a sense of the environment in the lab. And so I got to hear from them about their perspective, both grad students, lab techs, and an incoming postdoc, what they thought about the lab, how they chose her, and what their considerations were, and being able to ask some of the questions about mentoring style, feedback style. And so I chose to rotate in the lab because I heard really good things that aligned with how I wanted to receive feedback and mentorship. And then, I really enjoyed my time in the rotation lab. And I've been able to really connect with my PI and be able to, one of the things that was really important for me was being able to be like, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm bringing. These are things in my life that are important, both personally and in science. And she was really receptive about that and about keeping these things in mind. And so those were some of the considerations that I had. So I would say it's mentorship style. I'm really passionate about the science, but I also think that being in a very supportive environment kind of makes you really excited about the science as well. And just, having someone that you can go to and be able to receive the feedback and mentorship in a way that really resonates with you and that pushes you to, do better was really important for me.
Great. Thank you, Paula. And Lewis, how did you go about choosing your research advisor?
Yeah, so I had a similar experience to Paula in terms of pivoting a little bit. Just to give a little bit of context, when I was at Hunter, I received training in behavioral neuropharmacology, neuropsychopharmacology, using animal models of addiction. And when I came to grad school, I wanted to do a bit more basic science of reward and reinforcement learning. So I came into grad school at Brown, having an idea of what I wanted to do. And then I had to pivot a little bit towards the end of my second rotation because so we only do two rotations, keeping that in mind that if I were to do a third, it would have been this thing that I was going to rotate in the summer instead of having committed to a lab. Um, and funding was a big issue at Brown at the time, and the lab that I was in wasn't able to support me if I stayed. So I sat and looked at potential PIs that I could rotate in at the time. Um, and there's Carolina. She We do human laboratory studies in addiction, and I thought that there would be a couple of transferable skills from what I had done because I had some experience with humans, and I have some background in the addiction field. And I had a meeting with her in January when I was deciding for what would be my third rotation. It was a brief meeting, and it was great. I got the impression from that meeting that she would be a great mentor. Similar to Paula too, I wanted to have an advisor who was really supportive and had that reputation. My PI currently didn't have any grad students on campus, but luckily the time that I decided to start like talking to her about rotation, one of her alumni from the program was here at a defense. And I sent her a message on LinkedIn. I was like, hey, I think you'll be around for this. Could we have like a little coffee chat? And I met with her and I asked her a couple of questions. I knew what I wanted from a mentor. My experience with BPindo exposed me to different mentorship styles. Before I got to grad school, I worked in my lab at Hunter, but I also did two summer programs, one at Michigan and another one at Brown. And I had a good idea of what mentorship looked like to me and something that I needed a PI that I looked up to in terms of mentorship style. And everything that I heard from this alumni from my program in the lab was all that I was looking for. I needed a PI who was supportive, somebody who would respect student boundaries, but also somebody who respected students' enthusiasm for their research and their interest without shutting it down with like administrative stuff and or the goals of the lab. And luckily, like the goals of the lab and my research align, but because I was scared of pivoting in terms of model organism, mice and humans, um, I got the feedback that Carolina would be a great PI in that sense. And then I did a summer rotation, so I didn't just start working with her and to committed to the lab. I did a summer rotation, and we had many one-on-one meetings. We had a lot of conversations about my interests and about what she thought would be great. And something that I really liked is that every meeting she would ask me during my rotation, she would ask me, "How can I best support you for what your career goal is?" And I really like that. That really stood out from my rotation experience, and that has persisted since the beginning of the summer. And yeah, I really cared about mentorship style, also an alignment in terms of work-life boundaries, and somebody who just respected that I will be curious and that doesn't get in the way of the things having to get done.
Great. Thank you, Lewis. And then
Of course.
moving on to our panelist questions. I know you all a little bit touched upon this, but to start off, what do you need to consider when choosing a research advisor? What questions do you ask PIs or lab members about making a decision on whether to join their lab after your rotations? And let's start off with Paula.
Yeah, so I actually received through the what was used to be the G6 lab a PDF that was a get an advisor, so like a PhD advisor guide and a list of questions. And I looked through those as I was, talking with PIs for rotations, but also later with lab members. And as you get to know people in the lab, people, start opening up, and you can also ask other grad students like, hey, what happens when you disagree? Like, how do they approach it? How do you approach it and solve conflicts too? Because sometimes, in the beginning, people aren't as, open sometimes, or, different people have different ways of reacting to situations. And so I made sure to ask like, hey, do you feel like when the PI doesn't give you like the feedback or, information in a way that you're receptive to, are you able to go? And so that was really important for me, because the grad student was like, hey, if we ever like have a miscommunication, I can just, go to her door later and be like, hey, this is what happened. This is how I'm feeling about it, and really talk it through and solve it. And I really liked just how upfront my PI is, because whether it's like a personal or professional thing, if there's like some sort of mixed communication, being able to go and, have good communication solves a lot of issues in a lab and, during your PhD. And then other questions that I asked people were, my PI really cares about like individual experience in the lab. So she actually has a student compact. And that to me was really interesting, because I hadn't heard any PI have it before. It's a contract basically where she outlines expectations for like your hours, like what is she's expecting your work to look like, things like that, disagreements, all of that is in there. And I found it really refreshing that she was so upfront, and that she sent that to me early in my rotation for us to, discuss. And if there's any stuff like I found confusing or we wanted to modify, like it was an active conversation. And I really liked that she had taken the time to think about what her expectations were. So, I got to talk to people in the lab and her about like, what are your expectations for work hours? What is the environment like? How do people interact with each other? And really be able to make a decision based on that. So let me have the PDF here on that one. One of the important things that Lewis brought up was funding. I think especially like in our current, day and age, it's a really important thing to ask a PI, like what is their current funding situation, and are they actively going to be encouraging you to, apply for fellowships for the career experience, or is that something that is going to be a stressor as you are doing your PhD? Do you need to be looking for funding because the PI would like you to get your own as soon as possible? Because that can also really change the dynamic and the way that you have to approach your work. And it might not be something that, everyone is comfortable with, or, you want to do as you're getting settled into a lab.
Thank you, Paula. And Lewis?
Yeah. So similar to Paula, a lab compact. Um, I've been in labs that had a lab compact before and labs that didn't. And not a big sample size, but the best experience was with the ones where there was an established resource in the lab for you to have this conversation with the PI, where it's not coming like from out of nowhere. It's not like I'm like there's a structure to have this conversation with the PI, and I really like that. So in my program, you have to complete like a pre-rotation report of the things that you look forward to in the rotation. So there are questions about like, is the rotation going to be me checking out the vibes in the lab, trying to like see if I match with the lab mates, if with the PI, the structure of lab meetings and stuff. But there's also like how much science do I have to get done? So I was able to have those conversations and then like go into the lab specific agreement of what are my career goals and how could my PI like advised me through it. So something that my PI cared about during my rotation was I wasn't set, or I'm still not set on whether I wanted to go into the academia and industry. And that's something that my PI and I emphasized a lot during our meetings, because she wanted to make sure that if I stayed in her lab, she would be able to support me in exploring both fields, so that at the end of my PhD, I would decide if I want to go into academia and industry. And something that also came in clutch for my decision in staying with her was the diversity of funding in the lab. So we do have funding from NIH and NIAAA, but at the time we also started industry funded trials. And hearing from my PI about how she decided to pivot in terms of funding immediately because she cared about the lab being funded, and everybody in the lab not being worried about whether they would be getting paid or if we like had to get our own funding at the time. I think that was really helpful, because the scare of funding as a first year was really scary. I remember my first semester of grad school. I think I may have spoken to you about this, Dr. Fernandez, during my GSEC interview, about how I was like, the conversation switched from, would you be a good mentor, to straight up me asking PIs, do you have funding? Would you have funding for me if I stay in your lab after the rotation? Because I don't want to do a rotation. Not saying that like the rotation would be a waste of time if I don't get to stay because it's a goal of rotation, but I was really kind of concerned about like job security and what like I wanted to do something purposefully so that I could find a lab instead of being able to explore in other things, which was a really scary time. And I think my PI stake on the situation was really comforting as somebody who's like, there's not that much funding I can apply for right now as a first year. I just completed my classes. I don't have any preliminary data to apply for an F. I could apply for the NSF, which I was planning to do at the time before we couldn't do it anymore. Um, and she was like, "It's I will support." Something that she said that like stands out to me. So she was like, at the time we didn't have like funding, or like she had submitted for some grants, and she's like, if these grants come in, like I'll be able to support you throughout your PhD, but like I'll also support you to get your own funding at the right time. Like I don't have data right now, and it would be like a thing that could get in the way of me getting preliminary data, trying to write a grant on when I could just like be gathering the preliminary data and apply next year when it makes more sense. So that was really helpful. Having a PI who looks out for the lab and like actively speaks about it was really helpful in my decision for staying here.
Great. Thank you both, Paula and Lewis. And moving on to the second question, how do you determine if a laboratory is a good fit for you long term? What if you're not a fan of the research project you're assigned? Do you focus on the research or on the mentor? And then Paula?
I think it has to be a balance for like between the research project and the mentor. If it's an environment where you're not thriving, where, it's hard to, get to lab every day, it doesn't matter how much you love the project, it's just gonna get in the way of that passion. But if you also really don't like the science, like there's only so much that you can do that will motivate you when the experiments don't work. So it's a balance. I lean more towards the mentor and the lab environment because I think when everyone else is like very supportive and very excited, you can, that energy also gets to you and it feeds you. And so you can find a lot of stuff for me. I can find a lot of things that are interesting and be able to, get excited with everyone else and explore new things. Um, I think some of the considerations for that would be like, how willing are you to, uh, do a project that you might not like. I think one of the really important things too is as you're deciding whether to join a lab is what are the available projects? What is the PI's like approach to that? Is that a conversation? Is that something they assign to you? So for example, for me, I got a couple options and we spoke through them and I had a couple weeks to figure out like, let me look into all of these and see which one I find the most interesting my thesis work on. Um, sorry, Rob, do you mind reminding me the initial part of the question?
Yes, no problem. And the first part is how do you determine if a laboratory is a good fit for you long term?
I think it was like being in the rotation and being in the lab and seeing like, can I, continue like in a month where the experiment doesn't work? Is this like an environment that's going to be supportive? And I can ask the PI for help. Can I ask other lab members for help? So, sometimes your PI isn't available. How do people approach projects? Some labs, people are very focused on their individual project or the projects are really different and you don't have someone to bounce off ideas. So in my lab, like I can just go like, hey Rob, I have this idea. Does this make sense to you? Or I'm having trouble troubleshooting and everyone's willing to help. So for me, that was really important fit long term. I think you also have to think about like what are the expectations for hours and work? Is that something that, in a rotation, it can be pretty short and you're like, oh, everyone's pulling long hours. I'll pull long hours too. But a PhD is, 5 years. And so can you do that long term? Is that something you want to do? And like what is like balancing your personal goals as well with like what the lab expectations are.
Thank you, Paula. And Lewis, just to recap, how do you determine if a laboratory is a good fit long term? And what if you're not a fan of the research project you were assigned? Do you focus on research or on a mentor?
Had a mentor, Dr. Marguerite Matthews once told me, if you can't be good, you have to be careful. You can't do that long term. Um, and that stuck with me because she said that to me. I just came from the Society for Neuroscience conference. She said that to me at the last one, when I was still doing rotations. So when the funding stuff happened, I kept that in mind. I wanted to make sure that I didn't have to be hyper vigilant in the lab during my rotations about my attitudes, but also just like my interest. I am the type of person who's like extremely curious and will ask a random question not related to anything we're actively doing in the moment. Because I'm like, wait, what is this? Um, and I was lucky to have great rotations, and get a good idea of like, hey, this is possible. PIs are really supportive. Um, but when it comes to whether I'm passionate about the research or the mentor, something else that I wish I could quote them by name. I wish I remember who said this, but somebody once told me you can do a great research project if you're feeling amazing, whether you're passionate about it or not. Make sure that you feel good and that you feel supported because you can do anything with that. Your research interest is really good. You should do the research that like drives you and keeps you interested and keeps you like interested in the field, but also you need to recognize that you need to be good while you do it. You need to find like your healthy habits. You need to feel like you belong while you're doing it, even if like I don't want to say don't do what you're like not interested in doing and prioritize a good lab, but I do want to say that because it matters. It's science in academia and grad school can be very exhausting. Um, you can drain yourself pretty quickly. And a lot of that ties to the culture of certain subfields of like neuroscience or like the biomedical sciences. Um, but that doesn't apply to like every lab in that field. Like you can try to find a mentor who does something closely related to what you're trying to do, but really focus on somebody who will nurture you as a scientist, not just nurture your project, because you're the one getting the degree, not the project. And you need to stand up at your defense and like accept it, which you can't do if you're not, if you're like, if you go too far and you push yourself too hard, you won't like people do it. I just don't want to be drained at the end of my PhD because I had a mentor who didn't understand work-life boundaries the way that I do, and who didn't understand that like, hey, I need to be okay for this project to be as successful as we want it to be. But there's a balance in both. I was lucky to find a PI who does something that I was interested in. And she was also even able to nurture my interest in addiction field back, which was really cool. Um, but yeah, a good mentor is what you need to have to survive, I think, more than a project that will keep you going back to lab. Because the project is an inanimate object you won't get gratification from. But your PI, if they're good, they'll be like, hey, I know this experiment didn't work, but you're doing great. Like, it's the protocol, it's not you. You need to have somebody who can tell you that.
Great. Thank you, Lewis and Paula. On that note of work-life balance, our next question is what is expected as a grad student when it comes to work-life balance, conducting experiments, how long to stay in a research laboratory, managing classes, and how do you maintain these boundaries with all of these responsibilities as a grad student? Paula?
I think that really depends on the initial conversation you have in your rotation as well, and when you join the lab. So as well as finding that information out before you start. But for me in my lab, like I was really clear, like, hey, like for me, work-life balance is really important. I need to do these things outside of lab that help me recharge and get energy for the next day, especially when the experiments don't work. Um, and that was like an expectation that I discussed, including like vacation time and sick leave and all those things. But it depends on the PI. I've seen labs where, I work personally like in a 9 to 5 schedule. There's of course sometimes like an experiment doesn't work or it goes long and I, thought the wash and all of this would take, a specific amount of time and next thing you know, it's taken double the time. But the times where I'm in lab, like at 7 p.m. are pretty rare and I make sure to balance it out because I know that if I do like 3 days in a row until 8 p.m., I'm gonna burn out. Like I'm not gonna be helpful or productive in the lab the next day. And it's not helpful to me either because I'm not getting proper rest. But being able to discuss that with the PI up front and being like, hey, what are your expectations for hours? I'm thinking of this is really important. I think that can also be influenced by what you see in the lab. So some PIs like I've spoken to other friends that are like, no, I don't have any pressure from my PI, but they're there at 2 in the morning in the lab because everyone else is in the lab really late. And so there's, that lab culture that maybe the PI hasn't explicitly said so, but it's like, oh, if everyone's doing it and I also want to look productive, like, people are doing those long hours. And so being able to see what's going on in the lab and having that conversation with the PI is so important. In terms of classes, I think there's different approaches too, where some are like, oh, the research comes first. But I found the most support where PIs are like, oh, well, you're a student. That makes sense that, you need to do the homework and you need to go to classes, or I have a TA ship next quarter. So being able to be upfront and all of that, um, it's important. And with experiments, just I have weekly meetings with my PI. And so I'm able to be like, hey, this is what I did this week. This is what I'm planning for next week, and be able to discuss like, this is what went wrong. This is how I'm troubleshooting it, and being able to ask like, is this a good way of thinking about troubleshooting this? Or how do you, being able to plan some of those experiments as I'm starting out has been really helpful for managing expectations of my like productivity levels, as some people might call it, or just like what is expected of me to be doing and at what pace. And just being able to be like, hey, actually, I found this week really crazy because of this reason. Like I'm planning to do this at a later date, or I'm reorganizing my schedule to be able to take that into account. I think are good ways to communicate your feelings and your expectations and be able to manage those. Because as I expect during my PhD, those will also change, as I become more independent and be able to do things on my own.
All right. Thank you, Paula, for that insightful answer. And Lewis, similarly,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I don't have much of a hot take of this, but I one thing that I like about academia and one thing that would like is definitely like impacting my decision whether I go into industry or not after this is that I like the flexibility of my schedule. And I indulge in it. I tried at some point to treat academia, and I may need to talk to Paul about it because I think it's a healthy approach. But I think I'm doing good with what I have. I can't do a 9 to 5 because I have really bad ADHD. And there are days where I just don't have it in me to produce anything in the early morning or late in the day. So I try to be flexible with my schedule and I like do things as I go and see like what needs to get done. And but something that I do care about is my sleep. And regardless of like whether I work like an 8 hour day or not, you will not see me in front of my computer past 7. But I can't unless I'm like doing like a passive task, which like is like probably like reading or I'm teaching now and it's like taking up a lot of time. So I like grade usually at the end of the day. But I try to be flexible and understanding of what my body can do. Um, I took me a bit to learn that like for example, if I'm writing, I'm really good at writing in the morning and then I'm good at other types of tasks later in the day. So I like break down my day based on like the type of things that I need to get done, and I work around it. Um, for example, there are days that I cannot, like I'm too tired or like TAing is taking up a lot of my time. And as much as I want to get through the end of the day, I just don't. I know that I'm pushing myself if I like do that. If I do that paper, if I like do that experiment really late. So I like sometimes end my day early and then like I do some things in the weekends, but I avoid doing it too much. So I find balance in based on like the tasks that need to get done at the time and I adapt to that. But I also like try to monitor. my time and don't work like more than 40 hours a week or something like that. Um, but in terms of like how long my day is, it really depends. I think today is one of those days where I T8 and for example, I have to go to lab because I just came back from SFN, but I don't think I will be able to do anything past 3. Um, and there's a philosophy that I got from my PI that took me a while to learn, but first rest, then we work, um, that I keep in mind a lot. So if I try to get rest as much as I can so that I can do things good. I find that I do really good science when I'm well rested. And that's what matters to me. Whether I can do a full like 8-hour workday, it's it depends on the type of the task that I have to do.
Great. Thank you, Lewis. And then wrapping up with our last question. As a second year grad student, how do you design a feasible thesis research project? Paula?
Yeah, great question. As I mentioned earlier, my PI and I spoke, and she gave me a couple of different projects that she had in mind. She was really helpful and organized them by her opinion of how feasible they were to like the more out there and risky. And I took some time to read on them and think about what I wanted to do. I decided on one where I felt I was personally the most uncomfortable, I would say, because I had the most gaps in my knowledge. And I think like the thesis is a great way to get pushed and like learn new things and expand my outlook. So for example, I've not never done neural circuits before. So my project is on neural circuitry. And I've really enjoyed, auditing a class to learn a bit more about it and talking with more people and expanding what I know about neuroscience and thinking in a different way. But I know that I feel comfortable doing so because my lab has my back and I can go and ask my PI, hey, I really didn't get this paper. And we did journal club a couple of weeks ago so that everyone could be like, this was a brainstorming session for Paula. And so we were all talking about it. And so I think knowing like to what extent do you have the support as you pick different thesis projects. There was a potential rotation PI that I spoke to, and he said that this is a project that he had for the next grad student, but he had never done anything like this before. So you're on your own. So it depends on like, are you going to be the one that's like more scrappy and like talking to other PIs and other labs and put together those ideas and be able to bring it to the lab? Or are you looking for something that is more within the wheelhouse of the lab and that you feel more comfortable with and that they're able to also support you as you become an expert in this area?
Great. Thank you, Paula. And Lewis?
Yeah. So when I did my rotation in the lab, um, my PI presented to me the projects that are going on in the lab. We do clinical trial stuff. So she presented to me the 3 main clinical trials we had at the time and had like gave me the time to like read and learn about them because I've never worked in like human laboratory models with clinical models. Um, and I ended up deciding on the project that was more holistic to my interest, not specific to like the mechanisms that I was interested in, but so I have background in neuroimaging and I have background in behavior, like I mentioned earlier, but I've never looked at peripheral biomarkers of like metabolism and immune activation. So I decided to do that, and then in our lab, there's like a lot of collaborators, and that's something that I wanted to learn, just like how to work with a large team of people. So my project is on MDMA-assisted therapy, and I'm looking at biomarkers of treatment response using neuroimaging before and after treatment. There are people who are the clinical psychologists, there are the pharmacologists, the MD PhDs, the experts in the neuroimaging field, and me. And I wanted to learn. And so I decided to do that. And it's feasible because it's a really good collaborative environment. Like Paula said, I can rely on my lab to like ask any questions and not feel like I would be judged or perceived as like, oh my God, you just like keep asking me questions. If anything, they like when I ask questions. And I think that's what made this project feasible for me and something that I think I could pursue and like develop more interests and like just keep learning. Because like Paula said, I think doing the project that you have like more gap in knowledge, it's kind of like the whole goal of the PhD.
Thank you, Lewis. And with that, we're going to be moving to our Q&A from the audience. So if you haven't had a chance, please ask your question in the Q&A function in the middle of the Zoom at the bottom. But starting off with our first question, how do you suggest to approach a potential supervisor? And I'm assuming this is probably either when you're rotating or when you're about to apply to grad school. Paula or Lewis, whoever wants to take this one.
I sent emails. So I read up the lab website. I checked out the recent papers. Are those methods and questions things that I can see myself doing or, that I might enjoy learning about? And then I sent them a brief email introducing myself, saying I'm interested in this project that you've been working on lately because of this, and then asking if they had time for a chat. And, PIs are very upfront. They'll be like, oh, yeah, I am taking. Oh, make sure you also say like, oh, I'm trying to for rotation because I'm looking for a lab. Or if you do have a lab, is this like for skills? Because some PIs might not have the space or funding to take a student permanently, but they might be open to just taking you for skills. So being able to be very clear on what you're looking for out of the rotation is important. And then they're really upfront. They're like, oh yeah, amazing. Like I have space. I'd love to talk to you. Or like, they're upfront if they don't have funding or if there's any other reason why they might not be able to take you.
Yeah, I think I'm a very big fan of cold emailing. Um, but there's like structure to it that I think a lot of people should learn about more because I've heard from PIs that they don't like getting cold emails, but like the person doesn't describe what they've done and what they could contribute to the lab. So I think if you're reaching out to somebody who you want to work with and you want to consider as a potential advisor, assuming that like you know the structure of your program and when it comes to like choosing an advisor, so for example, Brown Neuro, um, there's like a guide, not a guide, but there's this like uninformal thing that is passed down. Like you should just email them, have a chat, tell them that you're interested in rotating with, ask if they would take you. But the main thing that these PIs would like to know is what would you bring to the floor? What could you help them? And if you can, how does that help you? Because you don't want to just choose in the lab and think that like you shouldn't you shouldn't think that like you can just help the lab because you have like the research experience. The PI would also want to know how you think bringing your toolkit to the lab, what do you get back from that, and how could they help you as a mentor? So I think when you reach out to them and when you have these conversations, make sure that you say, yeah, I'm interested in this type of mechanism that you're studying. I've done something similar before, and I think if I do it with you, I could learn how to troubleshoot it more because I've never done it before. Or maybe we could do it at a larger scale because I've only worked in like small samples. So thinking about not only what could you bring to the lab, but what you anticipate will how that brings comes back to you. And I see a question about the co-mentorship here. So someone asked, they're rotating and currently considering co-mentorship between two labs. I am unofficially co-advisor, I would say, because of I work closely with the director of the neuroimaging facility here at Brown for my project. And like something that comes across a lot is like how much time do I spend working for the labs versus for my project. Um, so I think having conversations about how much you have to contribute to the research that is going on in the lab is really helpful and how that like will guide your project because you don't want to like I've also have friends who are co-advice who tell me that they like work like they have an aim with a lab and an aim with another one. So they like spend half their PhD in one and half the other in the other one. So try to figure out like the structure that the PIs anticipate would be for your thesis. Like are like all your aims for your dissertation like dependent on something that happens in both labs, meaning that you have to equally spend like concurrently spend equal time in both labs, go to both lab meetings, or could you just like do aim one in this lab and then go into the do the next experiment in the other? So having that conversation might be helpful.
Yeah, I don't have experience being co-mentored myself. depends. And it can really depend on the PIs. Some of them, like one is really focused and really good at mentoring, and the other one's more hands off, or they're both equal. And there's like 4 lab meetings they're going to, and scootering down the street to one and going up the other on the same day. And so those expectations, I'm like, what does the day-to-day look like? What is the funding too? Because some of them are like, oh, if I'm more hands off, like I shouldn't be the primary. But I also think you have to think about like how do those two PIs interact with each other? Do they know each other before? Are their personalities going to clash? Are you going to get one idea from one and then the opposing idea from the other if like the aims are, related? I think having meetings with all of you three together is really important. But I think you also have to think about like, do you want to be co-mentored? Sometimes like PIs bring it up, sometimes students bring it up. And you have to decide, like, is that like a dynamic you want to, work with? Because it is sometimes double the work, definitely more schedules to move around, but also different expectations and mentoring styles. And you need to figure out whether those two PIs complement each other.
Yeah, and like the something else that you just reminded me with the funding point is I've seen the situation where somebody gets co-advised just because one PI has money and the other one doesn't. And that dynamic between the PIs has gotten really bad. So think about like, is the collaboration, if it's like for funding, is the collaboration needed? Or like, look, is the co-mentorship needed, or could you just like collaborate with that person for your dissertation? Like, there's a lot of bureaucratic stuff that comes from being co-mentored that if you're concerned about like the PIs not getting along all the time, like maybe you could have a collaboration with this other PI and have them be the chair of your dissertation, of the chair of your committee, which at least at Brown, it's like different than your PI. So think of if you're concerned that like you've never done this before, or like the PIs don't have a good reputation in like mentorship individually, or like if they've never done it together, think about like alternatives and then like make an informed decision once you've like covered, can they be like do a tier of like things and think about, can they be collaborators? Like what if we just my thesis is like a collaboration between my lab and their lab? If not, like could they just be the chair of your like committee instead of like both being your like advisors? Because then that means that you need to have like 4 people. Yeah, here that means you would have to have 4 people on your committee because you have 2 advisors and you have to have your chair and someone else and then an external person. So think about like what would make more sense with what your interests are and the feasibility of your PhD.
Great. Thank you, Paula and Lewis. If anyone else has any further questions, we would appreciate if you send them in the Q&A or in the chat. I would say, in light of questions, how would you approach funding in this current landscape for prospective first-year grad students? Paula?
For first year students, I would be very upfront. If you, it depends on the program too. So figure out if the programs you're either applying to or, the one you're currently in, what is their worst case scenario if a lab's funding falls through? Does the program support you? Does the department support you? Or is it up to the PI and you, like you have to find like a TA job? And then I would just be really upfront and direct and being like, hey, this is a concern for me. What happens if, like, what is the actual funding situation? What happens if funding falls through? And just have those very, direct, frank conversations so that everyone's on the same page. And, there's never any confusion. My PI personally had like state of the lab meeting over the summer where we went through all the funding discussions and everything. And so that was really refreshing too to hear from a PI. But most PIs will tell you like, as I was like trying to find rotation labs, they're like, hey, I can take you, but I can't guarantee a spot unless this R01 gets funded. And so that you can make a decision on like, am I willing to risk, like Lewis said, spending all this time and investing all this time and effort for a rotation that might not be even a possibility and pan out as a possible option? And what kind of like things are the PIs thinking about for funding?
I think at this point it's really fair to assume that PIs know if they would take a student. So I highly emphasize, and I say this to everybody, Do not put yourself in a situation where you're waiting for the PI to tell you yes. I think so something that I've hated about a situation was having conversations earlier on. And again, have these conversations like as soon as you can. Because you don't want to waste time. And not saying that like a rotation is like a waste of time, but you don't want to have to do something because somebody had you waiting, somebody else had you waiting. Um, yeah, try to have the conversations earlier and don't take a maybe from PIs for too long because you want to make sure that you work with somebody who's very proactive and can tell you an answer. And if not, then it's okay. Something that I had a conversation about at this conference I just went to, it's okay if you have to pivot from your interests in grad school. It's okay if like the things you wrote in your statement are not the things you're doing. You're like, it's care about like job security a little bit and also your mental health. If you end up in a lab that you chose because of your interest only, and like mentorship is good, but funding is bad, then you have to think about how much time in your PhD you're going to spend applying for fundings. Um, so think about what you see yourself doing in the future and how willing you are to go to certain extents.
One thing that Lewis was saying too is with the funding, if funding is a stressful thing in the lab, it's going to stress everyone out and really change that lab culture and those lab dynamics. Because, like, of course, everyone's going to be stressed about job security. PIs might be stressed about, you know, do I go to another institution? Can I find funding? And that might also change the dynamics. I think. Yeah, being really upfront, I agree with what Lewis says. Like, if the PIs are unsure, it is risky if your program only gives you X number of rotations, because you got to make all of them count, you know? You got to make sure they're all viable options and things that you would enjoy doing. If you're really set on a lab and you think it's perfect and it's on the first go, then, I would still suggest like still use those other rotations as potential options and be open to like a new experience of a new research interest or a new mentorship style or lab culture that you might not know. But yeah, in the current funding situation, I think it's really important to know how many rotations your program allows, but also like Lewis was saying on the summer rotation, can you do a summer rotation if, let's say, you're really set on joining the lab and then the funding falls through? Do you have the opportunity to do like my program? There's 3 rotations. Can you do that fourth rotation in the summer? Or what does it like? How does it work? And what are different programs doing in those situations?
Great. And with that, I think we should probably wrap up. So I would say, what final words of advice do you have for either prospective grad students or first year grad students navigating choosing a research advisor in this current landscape?
I think find somewhere where you can see yourself, waking up happy every day and going and enjoying the environment and enjoying the people. And if there's one thing that's really important to you, whether it's professionally or personally, like family commitments or a health concern or some volunteering thing you do that is really important, make sure you're upfront and that you tell a PI, this is something I really care about. And I want to make sure it is incorporated or taken into account in all these expectations. Like if you have children, or a health, concern that might be, an ongoing thing, like make sure that is part of the conversation so that when things come up, like, it doesn't take anyone by surprise and you have a supportive PI that understands that like, oh, you know, I'm sick at home and I can't come in because of this. You have had the discussions about all these situations and you can plan for it and just find someone that whose mentorship, even when things go wrong, like an experiment goes wrong or you messed up, is, supportive and going like, okay, how are you going to try it again? And not, you feel like you can go and do it over and over. Um,
Yeah, I think something that I would say is from the moment you get to your graduate program, be active about building a community and a village of people who will support you. It's really hard as a grad student, um, having to feel like a freshman in college again, because you have to like remake all a friend group and establish things. But something that I found really helpful is having a village to support me. whether that was in the program, with faculty or like upper year students, or like outside of the program and also in the city that you're in. I think grad school in academia itself tends to push people to like isolate because you like have to work hard and do all this stuff. But at least for me, I grew up in a small village in the Dominican Republic. I knew all my neighbors growing up, and I always look for that anywhere that I go. So, and I find that to be like extremely helpful now that I'm a grad student. Having a village to support you, uh, making sure that your mental health is not just you. I think something that I like to explore is a Western type of like self-care that involves like you take your time, you take some alone time and like like do things by yourself. It's okay if you need to not be alone and try to not be alone so much because the science can get really isolating. Like if like mental health care for you is like I need to take some alone time, which for me it is sometimes, it's okay. But push yourself a little bit and build a village so that you have people who look out for you in really bad scenarios and you don't feel like you're always pushing yourself all the time alone. It's really helpful to have a little village of people who care.
Great. With that, thank you, Paula and Lewis, for taking the time to give this webinar on selecting a research advisor. And thank you all in our audience for attending. This webinar will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. And have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Okay.
Say, everybody.